Hi everyone, and welcome back to Bowdie Shorts, making law make sense in 15 minutes or less. In our last couple of episodes, we've learned how trusts are created. We've looked at declaration of trust, constitution of trusts, trustees, beneficiaries, and trust property. But now we reach a really important question, because once a valid trust exists, we need to know who actually benefits from it. Or to put it another way, who gets what, and when do they get it? And that's exactly what today's video is all about. So the big question here is, whenever you're dealing with beneficial entitlement, start by asking, what exactly is this beneficiary entitled to? Because not all beneficiaries have the same rights. Some are entitled immediately, some only become entitled if they satisfy a condition. Some only receive income, some receive capital, and some aren't entitled to anything at all unless the trustees choose them. So before looking at different beneficial interests, we need to make one important distinction. What's capital and what's income? So capital is underlying property. For example, a house, shares, a bank account balance, a painting. The property itself is the capital. Income is what the property produces. So examples would be rent from a property, dividends from shares, interest from a bank account, coupon payments on bonds. Income is the return generated by the capital. Now, why does this matter? Well, because a trustee can give different people different rights. One beneficiary may receive the income, another may receive the capital, and trusts can therefore distribute benefits in surprisingly sophisticated ways. Now, we're going to begin now by looking at what are called fixed interest trusts. Now, remember from our last video, the settlor decides who gets what. The trustees have no discretion. So the first category we've got to look at here are what are known as vested interests. So what's a vested interest? Well, a vested interest exists where the beneficiary exists and no conditions need to be satisfied. The entitlement is therefore immediate and unconditional. So a trust says, my shares are held on trust for my son. That's it. No conditions, no age requirements, no uncertainty. The son has a vested interest. Now, why is this important? Well, because if that beneficiary dies, that interest does not disappear. Instead, it forms part of the beneficiary's estate. The interest passes under their will or through the rules of intestacy. Now we come to the second category, contingent interests. A contingent interest exists where entitlement depends on a future event. Something still has to happen. So a trust says, my shares are held on trust for my son if he reaches 25. The son is currently 21. He's not yet entitled. His interest would remain contingent. So ask, what happens if the condition isn't met? That's the key question. If the beneficiary dies before the condition is satisfied, the interest usually fails and the property will pass elsewhere according to the terms of the trust. Now, vested or contingent is one of the most common SQE questions. So always ask, is there still something the beneficiary must do before becoming entitled? If yes, contingent. If no, vested. Now, trust can go one step further because property can benefit different people at different times. This is known as successive interests. So the classic example, a trust might provide income to my spouse for life, remainder to my child. Now we have two different beneficiaries. The spouse receives the income. during their lifetime, and this is called a life interest. The child receives the capital, so once the life interest ends, the child is known as the Remaindermen. Now, the important distinction here is the child's interest is vested but postponed. So the child owns the beneficial interest, but they simply cannot enjoy it yet. Now, you might be thinking, why is that not contingent here? Well, because the child doesn't need to satisfy any condition. The only thing that has to happen is time, specifically the ending of the life interest, and that's certain to happen eventually. Now we need to look at absolute versus limited interest, which is another really useful distinction. Now, an absolute beneficiary receives capital and income. A limited beneficiary receives income only or another restricted benefit. And that's often how life interests work. Now, we now need to move into a completely different world, the world of the discretionary trust. Now, the big difference when we look at a discretionary trust is the settlor does not decide who benefits, the trustees do. So what rights does an object have? Well, initially, almost none. Why? Well, because nobody's been chosen yet. The members of the class are merely objects of the trust. They have hope, expectation, potential, but not entitlement. So to put this into an example, a trust says, for such of my children, and in such shares as my trustees decide. Until the trustees make their decision, no child has an individual proprietary right. Now, when does entitlement therefore arise? Well, the moment trustees exercise their discretion. At that point, an object becomes a beneficiary and their entitlement vests. Now we reach one of the most important principles in this video, the principle in Saunders and Vautier. The question here is, can beneficiaries end a trust early? And often the answer is yes. So suppose there is one beneficiary, aged 18 or over, who's mentally capable with a vested interest. That beneficiary can demand, give me the trust property now, and the trustees must comply. Now, what type of trust is this? Well, this is actually a bare trust. Well, why? Because the beneficiary is absolutely entitled. The trustees are really just holding the property temporarily. But the principle goes further. Multiple beneficiaries can also bring a trust to an end, but there are conditions. So all beneficiaries must be in existence, be identifiable, be 18 or over, have mental capacity, and agree. And collectively, they must be absolutely entitled. In other words, nobody else can have a potential interest. Once again, why does this matter? Well, imagine 3 beneficiaries all agree, but there's a 4th potential beneficiary whose future interest hasn't been ruled out. In this case, the rule simply will not work because not everybody who could benefit is involved. So whenever you see a Saunders and Vautier problem, ask, who has an interest? Is that interest vested or contingent? Is everyone in existence? Is everyone over 18? Is everyone capable? Does everyone agree? The answer is yes throughout. The trust can be terminated early. Now let's bring this all together. Beneficial entitlement really comes down to understanding rights. Different trusts create different rights, and different rights affect who receives the property, who receives the income, when entitlement arises, and whether the beneficiaries can collapse the trust. So what's Bowdie's bottom line here? Well, every beneficial entitlement problem begins with one question. Who gets what? To answer it, you need to identify vested or contingent, absolute or limited interest, in possession or in remainder, fixed or discretionary. Once you've done that, the rights of the beneficiaries usually become much easier to understand. And remember, not everyone who might benefit from a trust is actually entitled to trust property. Sometimes entitlement exists now, sometimes it depends on a condition, and sometimes it depends entirely on what the trustees themselves decide. Thank you for watching this video in the Bowdie Shorts Trust series. Please look out for further trust videos available now via our playlist on YouTube. Thank you.